Hello and welcome back. What we're going to look at in this video is just getting your torch set up, and that's going to include the parts that you need, collet body, end caps, all that, and your tungsten. So I'll start off with just noting that there are a 1,000 different types of torches and torch parts and configurations. If you go online and you look up TIG torch parts, you'll be blown away with just how many options there are. But if you're just starting off and you're learning the TIG and you're just practicing on, T-joints or scrap metal, or just running beads, to do like a pad weld, you don't need any of those. And that's really the focus here. So I'm not going to get into specialized setups, but just your general setups. Now there are a couple of different styles of torches that I will reference, and for simplicity's sake, basically this is a water-cooled torch. This torch is rated for about 250 amps. I have to admit I'm not really good with the torch nomenclature, the names HW17, blah, blah, all the different types, because I welded at BIW. And when I got hired there, when I was learning to TIG and when I was first working in production, the only torches that we had or used were 350 amp water-cooled torches. They used the large TIG parts, and they were all liquid cooled. It wasn't until later that we got smaller torches, or at least I used them, and basically you had the big parts and the little parts, and that's what it is. And that's pretty much what I have here at the school. So TIG is kind of it's not a focus on my program. I'll leave it at that. Young people that are coming in, I think, are better suited with welding skills with stick or flux core, MIG, to get entry-level jobs and work their way up. Not many people are going to start off, TIG welding pipe. So it's, again, not an area that I focus on. But within these torches, what we have basically is a couple of different styles of parts. So this is the cup, okay? This would be the nozzle or the on a MIG gun. And inside here, if I loosen the end cap, and this end cap is a long end cap on this particular torch, if I don't lose all the parts. But these come in medium and shorter lengths. As the tungsten gets shorter, you don't need as long of an end cap. Or if you're in a tight restricted area, you may have to break the tungsten in half. And tungsten is brittle, you can snap it with a pair of pliers. You may have to break it in half to begin with in order to get your torch in a small area. But again, that doesn't affect a trainee, okay? You have a collet, and this collet is this small brass piece right here, or a copper piece, or some alloy thereof. And that's the part that actually grips and squeezes on the tungsten. And then finally there is the collet body. Now the collet body is going to either be of a gas lens type, and that's what this is, or it's going to be like a regular diffuser on a MIG gun. The gas lens basically has a screen on the front. The gas blows through, and as it comes through, it is diffused by that screen. It's like ultra-fine mosquito netting, and that diffuses that gas and gives better gas coverage. Your other type, which I'll show here in a second, which is similar to what you'd have on a MIG gun nozzle, simply relies on radial holes in the diffuser to basically allow the gas to escape. And when the gas escapes radially, it comes outward like this. There's a nozzle, or in TIG terms, a cup in the way, and that cup is going to force the gas to go forward. And that creates a little bit more of a turbulent effect on the gas. So if you're welding materials like aluminum, titanium for absolute certainty, you would not use a regular diffuser. You would use a gas lens type diffuser, okay? Cups come in, sizes that are measured in 1/16 of an inch. So this cup is a number 8. That means that the hole in the cup, not the physical size, but the hole of the cup is 8/16 or a ½ inch. They make them in ceramic. They make them in, this is ceramic, but there's white ceramic, and then there's this pink ceramic. I honestly don't know what the difference is. Never used the white ceramic cups, but I've seen them. There's Pyrex. A lot of times if you're welding titanium, you need massive flooded gas coverage inside and out of the part because of oxygen contamination, and they'll use a cup that might literally be, you know, the size of a shot glass or bigger, and it's Pyrex so you can see through it because it's in your way. But again, that's not something for the trainee, okay? Now these parts are the smaller parts, and I refer to those as the 26 style parts. They would go on either a 90 amp air-cooled torch or a 250 amp liquid-cooled torch. And in this case, we have the 250 amp liquid-cooled torch. Now, I'm going to pull up a 200 amp air-cooled torch. And the parts that are on here, actually, I'm going to grab the one with the gas lens just because we'll start off with parts that are similar. So this torch is set up the same way as the other one, it's just the parts are bigger, okay? Now this torch itself, the torch, is rated for 200 amps. This is a gas-cooled torch. It has a valve on it. You turn the gas on and off with the valve. The liquid-cooled torch is connected to a Dynasty 350 that has a gas solenoid to turn the gas on and off. But basically the parts themselves are going to be limited to about 200 amps, okay, that are in this. Now these same parts will fit on a smaller 150 amp torch. But again, the torch itself might be more smaller and more flexible, and that's rated for 150 amps, but you actually would use the larger parts. So if you went from the smallest size torches, you would use the little parts for 90 amps. Then you would go to the larger parts, which I'll pull out here as I'm talking, to get up to about 200 amps on a gas-cooled torch, 350 amps on a liquid-cooled torch, and then in the middle, that 250 amp liquid-cooled torch would again use the smaller parts again. So the liquid cooling helps out quite a bit. So I've got the same parts here with the exception of one piece, and this is this little spacer I'll talk about. So if I pull these parts out, and again this time I'm simply pulling them out from the front, I've got my tungsten, okay? I have my collet, which is much larger than the collet we had before. I have the gas lens diffuser. Again, it's got the same screen that we had before, it's just bigger. And again, this would be for up to 200 amps on a gas-cooled torch. And then I have this white part. This white part is a Teflon spacer. Now, the white piece on the end of your TIG torch is in fact Teflon. Teflon's white. If you use Teflon tape, gravity's still on. If you use Teflon tape for plumbing, then you've seen it. They darken it on your cookware so it looks more traditional, I guess. Let me grab this piece. Anyway, the purpose of that Teflon is to ensure that when you thread your parts in, and you always thread your front end parts in first, okay? This has to be threaded in before the end cap. It'll clamp the tungsten either way. You could tighten this down and then thread this in and it would grab it. But what will happen is it won't hold the parts in the correct position. And if this doesn't go in first, and this is true on all the torches, okay, I'm only going to talk about it here. If this doesn't go in first, what will happen is the cup, the ceramic cup, this is also a number 8 cup. The body is bigger because the parts are bigger, but the hole is where that number comes from, 8/16. This cup, when this threads on, it needs to bottom out on the back end of the cup. If that spacer is not in there, or these parts aren't installed correctly so that the back end is pushed in too much and the front end is sticking out too far, the cup will rest on the front end here. It will bottom out on that shoulder. When that happens, and especially if you're walking the cup, the technique that is most preferred by people in the TIG world, the cup will tighten down on that shoulder. As it gets hot, it will expand. It is ceramic, but it still expands. And when it cools, because it's held on by threads back here, the shrinkage will cause this to physically separate. It'll break the end off. It'll be a clean break like you're cutting glass, and you'll lose the whole end of your cup every single time. So you have to make sure that those parts are correct. Now, in theory, this white part that's on the torch is a universal adapter, and if the front end parts are screwed all the way in and they're to minimum tolerance, and the outer part, which is brazed onto the threaded part, are short enough, the back of the cup will rest on the outside of this, and you will not actually have cup separation, but you will find that most of the time you do. So it's worth getting that spacer. That little spacer is not necessary on the smaller torches because they're just set up a little bit differently. So I've got my collet. Again, I'm going to slide that in this case from the rear because I neglected to put it in while I was talking. And then I put in my end cap. You're going to adjust the tungsten to get the right amount of stick out. I would suggest in general starting off with that tungsten sticking out between 5/16 and 3/8 of an inch for fillet welds on T-joints with the number 8 cup. But that's kind of going to be user preference. You will discover once you start welding that if that is sticking out too far, your torch, especially if you're walking the cup, when it's resting on your material, will have to be angled so steeply forward that it will tend to melt your filler material backwards as you're putting it in. So it'll literally melt back like a icicle melting on the end. So you'll discover when you start welding exactly how much that is going to be stuck out. And it depends on whether you're freehanding or walking the cup, welding with stainless steel or, you know, steel. Stainless steel will melt back even easier. Angles will change, but again, that's something you'll pick up on when you're welding, okay? The last torch, and I'm only going to take just the front end off because this is the same. This is the diffuser, the standard style diffuser, okay? And again, in here it's called a collet body, okay? Because there is a collet, it's not going to fall out. Tungsten's pretty short. It almost fell out. There's a collet right here, again holding onto my tungsten, and that's the collet body style of gas diffuser, okay? So it's the gas lens, oh my God. It is the, let's try again. It's the MIG diffuser style collet body, okay, as opposed to the gas lens. Now, starting off, that right there with the number 6 cup, that's how I started, and that's how I would recommend that you get started. Here in the school, because of just lack of, to make my inventory requirements easier, I only buy number 8 cups. We're not doing anything that I can't do with a number 8 cup. And the number 8 cup has the advantage of where the radius is larger when you're walking the cup in a T-joint, where it's physically touching both sides of the T, the fillet in here, the area for the weld to pass through is a little bit bigger, and it will allow my students to get up to about a 1/4 inch fillet weld before the cup starts rubbing on the weld, and then the walking pattern, which we'll look at in the next video, will change. So there's a pattern for walking the cup on a fillet, and then when the fillet gets to a point where the weld is starting to bump on the cup, it gets a little bit erratic, and then eventually you get to that walking the cup, rolling the barrel, or figure 8 style that you see in all the pretty TIG videos that everyone likes to put online and show off their skills with. So basically, your collet body are going to be sized by the tungsten, okay? So if you have a 3/32 tungsten, you need 3/32 collet, and you need a 3/32 collet body. The end cap is going to be sized by the length of the tungsten. So if you're welding on a bench, you know, and that's what you're doing, decorative work, you're not in tight areas, you could use a full-length end cap for a 7-inch full-length piece of tungsten for the rest of your life. You'd never have to worry about it. There are mid-size and little button end caps that you can put on as the tungsten gets shorter. If you want to try those, feel free, but for getting started, TIG welding, they're just absolutely not necessary, okay? It's just an added expense. A number 6 or a number 8 cup is a good place to get started. You don't need ceramic cups, you don't need all that fancy crap. Just start off with standard parts. I like the gas lens parts because here at the school we also weld aluminum, so again, it's just, I basically buy one style of parts. I do have a few of, obviously, the diffuser style parts in the building because I want to show the students both, but I don't purchase them primarily, okay? I just buy the gas lens parts. They're bigger, they're bulkier, but we're in a booth, we're out in the open, we're high school students, they're just learning, it's perfectly fine, okay? All right, tungsten. There's a lot of different types of tungsten, and if you take the different types of tungsten and the size ranges that are available, it can get overwhelming. It's just one of those things. There's a lot to TIG welding. It's probably the easiest type of welding. Really, you take an electric torch, you melt the material, and you add filler material with your hand. You can see the puddle very easily because there's no smoke, there's no slag, but it's in a way one of the more complicated processes because of the options that are available. Okay, so when you start welding, just buy 3/32 2% lanthanated tungsten, okay, and be done with it. Don't get on the internet forums, don't listen to all that BS. It's just 2% lanthanated, it'll do everything. If you are welding for a company, you're going to use the tungsten that they say that you're going to use. So they have probably weld procedures that they're following. I worked at a shipyard, everything was procedured. So we used, when I was welding, we used 2% thoriated tungsten for everything except for aluminum, and for aluminum we used 1% zirconiated, and I think they still do use 1% zirconiated. The basic thing on tungsten is this. If you are welding on steel to get started, and you probably are because it's the cheapest way to get started learning how to TIG, and other materials don't react all that much differently with TIG, except for aluminum, your ferrous materials. But stainless steel and steel, they flow very similarly. Even copper nickel flows similarly. You can start with almost any tungsten that you want. Now, I'll throw a chart up on the screen here while I'm talking real quickly, but green tungsten is pure, okay? So basically tungsten is typically alloyed so that it has better mechanical or electrical properties. If you take an old school incandescent light bulb and you turn it on and off, you know, over time, the old mag light flashlights, remember those big mag light flashlights, 4D cell batteries, you could use it as a club, okay? And eventually that light would be dull and dim, and if you looked at the bulb, it was all, you know, gray on the inside. So those bulbs had tungsten filaments, and every time you turn them on, you have a cold piece of tungsten. So because of Ohm's law, resistance, you know, not Ohm's law, yeah, I guess Ohm's law, relationship between voltage and resistance and current, a tiny amount of that tungsten is vaporized and it collects on the inside of the bulb, okay? When you're TIG welding, every time you start and stop, the tip, which is sharpened, disintegrates slightly. And some alloying will help to alleviate that. If you're TIG welding aluminum or ferrous materials, you have, some tungstens will have a tendency to crack or split lengthwise. Some tungstens have a tendency to ball and form a hemispherical ball, which may or may not be desirable, depending on what you're doing for aluminum. That topic for another day. But the reality is that different tungstens do have different properties. However, when you're first starting, you will not notice the difference between those at all, I guarantee it. Additionally, even if you could tell the difference between them, you're going to be dipping and dunking and resharpening the tungsten so frequently that you will not benefit from those benefits. So if you take the old standard 2% thoriated tungsten, the tip would hold up a lot better over time than pure tungsten, certainly. The newer E3 tri-mix tungsten, which at least the Matheson brand I have has a purple band on the end of it, that holds up even better, okay? But I can't TIG weld in production in a tight environment long enough without accidentally hitting that tungsten because I'm welding with a mirror or I'm on my side or I'm upside down. I can't TIG weld long enough to benefit from that, okay? Now if I'm working at a bench, I could probably go all day without dipping the tungsten. 2% lanthanated will hold a good tip, it holds a stable arc, and it works pretty good for aluminum. You can ball it, and it works well. If you don't ball it, it will hold a reasonably good point. Other tungstens will turn into like a cauliflower head. I find 2% serrated, which is your orange, used to be orange, now it's gray, or some of it's, I guess, it could be either one, depending on the manufacturer. The one that I have here from Weldcraft actually says, new color change, used to be orange and now it's gray. And I used to have some of both, now I've just got that. But the only kind that I purchase here at the school, and it does everything I need it to do, and it will do everything you need it to do when you're first starting, is 2% lanthanated. That having been said, when you get your tungsten, you have to make sure that your tungsten matches the parts that you have for your torch, or vice versa. So you're typically going to sharpen your tungsten because we're going to be starting off welding on steel. We'll look at how to do that here in just a second. But the size of the tungsten, other than the type, okay, the size of the tungsten is going to determine the amount of amperage that you can carry. And again, 332 tungsten, you know, you could buy 3/16 tungsten, sharpen it to a micro point, and weld razor blades at 10 amps if you wanted to. I don't know why you'd want to buy a huge tungsten and grind all of it away, but you could. You can't buy 040 tungsten and weld 1/8" aluminum with it. Okay, it's just not going to happen. So 3/32 tungsten is a good balance between. It'll carry a couple hundred amps, which is all you need to weld on steel. And remember, your amperage that you're used to with stick and MIG are going to be a lot different with TIG because we're running electrode negative. So those numbers are going to be way off, okay? So you can carry 200 amps on steel. It's plenty of heat. You'll never need more. And you can also sharpen it down to a fine point to do really fine detailed work without spending all day grinding a whole lot of material. So it's a really good one-size-fits-all tungsten. So 2% lanthanated, 3/32. That's where I would start, okay? As for the other stuff, you know, play around with it. If I was exclusively welding stainless steel X-ray pipe, I'd buy E3, you know, rare earth tungsten, okay? If I was exclusively welding aluminum and it was 1/8" thick or less, I would either buy green or 1% zirconiated. But again, that's not generally the case for most people, and if you're working for a company, you're going to use what they give you anyway, okay? So let's look at how to sharpen tungsten. All right, so we've got our tungsten, and now we're going to go ahead and we're going to sharpen it. I've got some tungsten here that is already been sharpened on one end or the other, or both in some cases. This piece of tungsten has been sharpened on both ends, but you'll notice that there is, if you can see it on the camera, there's still a hint of the blue from the marking on the end of the tungsten. You can sharpen both ends of your tungsten. I'm not really a fan of that. I understand why people do it. They dip one end, they simply pull the tungsten out, they turn it around, and they use the other end. A lot of times when you dip the tungsten, you end up with enough crap on the end of the tungsten that it won't slide back through the collet body correctly, and it will bind up. So you're almost just as well, if you're in a production environment, to just have multiple pieces of tungsten only sharpened on one end, okay? The other issue with sharpening the tungsten on both ends is that if you're working for a company that works to a code, you know, you may be working for some small shop that's building signs and they just buy whatever tungsten's on sale because it's all steel and they don't give a crap. But if you're working for, you know, a shipyard, or you're working in the nuclear industry or a piping industry, petrochemical, they probably tell you what size and style tungsten that you're going to be operating. They have weld procedures. So that color on the end of that tungsten needs to be visible so that an inspector could come along and say, hey, I need to check your work, make sure you're doing stuff to code, and they need to be able to see that blue. So if it calls for you know, a 2% serrated tungsten, they want to see orange or gray, okay? And if they see blue, then they're saying, hey, you're not welding to code. The other issue with sharpening the other end is that, you know, if you don't remove all that paint, then you're going to have that paint burn, and it's going to cause bad welds because it will create contamination. With TIG, you do not have any form of cleaning agents, right? There's no flux, there's no slags. So if the material isn't clean to begin with, it's not going to stay clean. And in fact, it's only going to get dirtier. So when you already have paint on the end of your tungsten, you're going to create problems. The third problem is that not all tungstens are suitable for welding all materials. But if you're talking non-ferrous, and that non-ferrous happens to be aluminum or magnesium, now you have an issue where some tungstens just simply will not work well at all. Some tungstens will crack, some tungstens will ball up on the end in a manner that's not spherical, which if you're going to ball your tungsten, you want it to create a sphere. So you grind both ends of your tungsten, now you don't know what style tungsten that actually was. So again, I do not recommend grinding both ends of the tungsten. These are tungsten that are out of torches that students have been using, so some of them are ground. So let's take a look at how to grind them. I do not have a tungsten grinding machine here in the shop. I have the kids grind the tungsten the old-fashioned way. I ground on a bench grinder with a diamond wheel, and actually when I was at BIW we didn't even have diamond wheels. We ground with it was a green grinding wheel. I can't remember what it was, silicon carbide perhaps. But I have them grind on a diamond wheel. So I have a 180 grit diamond wheel on one end of the grinder. It is used for tungsten only, or at least it's supposed to be, and that's how we're going to grind our tungsten. To get started, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference to what angle you grind your tungsten. And this is, one of these hotly debated topics. What angle do you grind your tungsten? When you're welding to code, when you're welding pipe, if you're doing open root, consumable roots back in the day, you're welding aluminum, titanium, trying to weld little tiny, quarter-inch gauge line. Yeah, it makes a difference how you grind your tungsten. But when you don't know what you're doing and you're just beginning like my students are, I tell them, basically just grind the tungsten to the same angle every time. Essentially, it wants to look somewhat like the point of a pencil. And the old rule of thumb that I had back in the day was that the length of the grind should be between 1 to 3 times the length of the tungsten. And I always shot for about 1.5. So if I look at that taper, and that appears to be about 1.5 times the, in length of the diameter, I figure I'm in the ballpark. Basically, if it looks like a pencil, from the factory, you'll notice if you get pencils that are pre-sharpened, they're not as pointy as your pencil sharpener makes them. So I want it to look like a pencil that just came out of the box, not a pencil that came out of the pencil sharpener. Right? Let's look at how we actually do this. All right, so I've got my grinder on. I've got my piece of tungsten here. Now this is already sharpened, so I'm going to blunt this. I'm going to blunt it on the opposite wheel, which is just off camera. It's just a conventional grinding stone. So I have my piece of tungsten here, needs to be sharpened. This is a diamond wheel. We are not going to sharpen down at the bottom of the wheel. You're only going to sharpen at the top of the wheel, and here in the shop, you're basically going to rest your hand on this rest, and then you're going to allow the tungsten to touch the wheel, and you're simply going to turn it like so. You can chuck this in a drill and spin it while you're grinding, but again, I don't have the students do that. And you don't wear gloves when you're grinding on this because your glove can get caught in this gap, and it's going to be bad news for you. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to hold that tungsten. I've got it, but 3 fingers in my thumb, and I'm simply going to roll the tungsten like so. I'm going to brace my hand. I'm putting 2 fingers on this plate, 1 finger on my top finger just to brace it. You do whatever feels natural. So I'm going to start near the top of this wheel. I'm going to let the wheel do the cutting. I'm not pressing this in. And this tungsten will get hot. So again, if you push too hard and this gets hot, you're going to have to sit it down and let it cool. I'm simply rolling it around. As I get near the end, when I've gone beyond 180 degrees, I'm just going to reduce pressure and lift off. And then I'm keeping my hand in contact with the wheel the whole time, my hand here and my hand here, so that I can maintain a consistent angle. And again, only grind at the top edge of the wheel. Failure to grind at the top edge of the wheel can result in the tungsten being grabbed by the wheel, and it will flip it down, and it's dangerous. So you want to have face protection and eye protection on when you're grinding your tungsten. So now I've got a nice sharp point, and that's basically what we're looking for. Now the actual tip of the tungsten, and I can't see whether this is in focus on my camera, so if it's not, I guess you'll never know because I'll have refilmed it. The actual tip of that tungsten is not going to be carrying any amperage unless you're welding with like 5 or 10 amps. So it is okay to blunt off just the tip, and for that purposes I'll use the very, very bottom, and I will very lightly just let that touch. So I get a very, very tiny itty-bitty flat spot on the end of the tungsten. The other reason for doing that is that that tip of that tungsten may be cracked, because tungsten is very brittle. You can snap it with a pair of pliers quite easily.
and that point may break off and fall into my weld. So let me grab another piece and I'll touch these up. So again, here's another piece. This has been sharpened on both ends, and I'm going to just change the angle. Now the angle of the tungsten will affect the shape of the puddle, which will, affect your welding performance. But when you're first starting, you really don't know what in heck you're doing, so you just need the tungsten grind to be consistent. This tungsten's actually bent. I can feel it when I'm turning it. It's making it hard to sharpen it. So again, there we have it, and I'm going to just very, very carefully knock that end off. I'll flip the other end around. Now this piece actually has some contamination down below where I've sharpened on the side. You can either snap that off and grind below it, or if it's not bad, you can actually just come up here, and again, I'm just going to lightly remove some of that material. I'm actually grinding on the body of the tungsten, but just to get that contamination off, and it will not affect the taper. So that is a look at grinding tungsten. Again, the trick is just to keep the angle consistent when you start. And I would play around with those angles, as I have my students do, and go from, relatively blunt to extremely pointy and almost everything in between, and weld for a little while with one that's really blunt, see what the effect of it is. And this one here that actually has blue paint on it, I'm going to snub off on the other stone and then just chamfer this, because I don't want to use that end. Okay, so there you have it, grinding tungsten.